Welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Mideast News Hour. Guess what? I'm Carolyn Glick, your host. Over the past week, we've just had more information coming out about the Iranians not wanting to close the deal and the Biden administration saying, well, actually, we don't think that the deal is going to be closed until the midterms. And the IAEA came out and said that Iran is a threshold nuclear state. So to try to make sense of all of this, and maybe if we have time towards the end to talk a little bit about the U.S. Jewish community, where it was just reported last week that 8 American Jewish organizations are now involving themselves in the Israeli elections to help the Arabs. I could think of no one better to talk about and just get an overview of what's happening strategically and also in terms of the American Jewish community in Israel than my friend and frequent guest, Dr. David Wurmser. David was a senior member of the Bush administration's National Security Council. He's an expert in Middle Eastern affairs, and everybody who's been watching this show for a while knows why he's a frequent guest, because he's also just really, really smart and really fun to talk to. So, hey, David, thanks so much for being back on the News Hour this week.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor, Carolyn. It's always.
Oh, well, it's an honor to call you my friend, who I can call it and say, hey, can you do this show? And so I thank you. So, David, what do you make of how do you look at the state of play in the nuclear deal? Wendy Sherman, the deputy Secretary of State, telling Congress members in a closed briefing that the Iranians aren't likely to come to a deal until after the midterms. What is this at the same time that the IAEA says that they're now a threshold nuclear state and can assemble bombs at will within weeks anytime they decide to?
Well, I mean, first of all, the timeline that she gave, which is the elections, tells you everything you need to know. Is whatever position we have and whatever position the Iranians have, it's not because they don't want to come to a deal and that they don't, and that we're not going to give in to the Iranians anymore. I'm sure we will. They realize politically they can't until 2 months from now. So it's now a political timeline, not a negotiation or diplomatic timeline. And I think that tells you everything, which is that we intend to go ahead with the deal. And the second thing is you have to look at the underlying factors. And the basic one is we have no plan B. The United States basically has taken the line that Iran is crossing the nuclear threshold. It is about to go nuclear. It will go nuclear unless you have this deal. So you can choose. Then they're turning to Israel and saying, you can choose. You can have them go nuclear and everybody will just live with it. Or you can go for this deal and we will save the world. So that's essentially.
I don't understand on 2 levels. Why does the administration care about the elections? I mean, the likelihood of them being able to get a better situation in Congress after the midterm elections is very low. So why wouldn't they want to just ram it through or whatever before the midterms, since they're dead set on it anyway, and they don't seem to care about anything other than advancing this agenda? And the other thing that I don't understand is, what is their argument to Israel? I mean, if Iran is already a threshold nuclear state, how on earth would this deal push that back? I mean, they have the ability to build a bomb. So why would this deal make any difference in Iran's being a threshold nuclear state?
Well, I think in the world this administration lives in, the actual ability to restrain Iran isn't as important as the political gain from having done what Trump couldn't do or didn't do, and to reverse the Trump era policies. I think it so motivates this crowd. I don't think that they believe they can really stop Iran. So I think what the deal really amounts to is to acknowledge Iran as a threshold state that at will can very quickly become a nuclear power, but on their watch, at least, try to maintain the fiction that they're not a nuclear power. So they're willing to let them to go up to the line and develop an ability. And I think this is what the real elements of this deal that are most disturbing. It gives them the resources, obviously the money, but it also gives them the ability to go and install, test, and work through all the very advanced centrifuges that they've now amassed. And with that, they can go from maybe a couple months to go from 3% enrichment and no stockpile to a nuclear arsenal capable uranium stockpile to a couple weeks, because they can enrich at such high rates and so much amounts.
But isn't
Perhaps
that
even
what
also
the
the plutonium.
but isn't that what the IAEA said that they have already? I mean, they said that they have
Yes.
it already.
Well, I think the deal will somehow create a fiction. We don't know the terms of the deal for real, but the deal will somehow maintain the fiction that they've walked back from that. Namely, there will be a transfer of authority over the nuclear, over the uranium. And I say transfer of authority because the previous deal, as bad as it was, at least it transferred the uranium out of the country. So the Iranians didn't have the ability just to put their hands on it. It's not clear to me, but I've heard some reports that the uranium in this case will be left in Iran, but under international supervision, perhaps Russian supervision. And the reason for that is the Iranians believe that's the only guarantee they have. If the United States walks out again, that they can basically just go nuclear immediately. So this deal essentially allows them to walk right up to the line, if they live within the framework of that deal, by the way. This is all assuming that the Iranians will be above board and they won't do anything that's not allowed beyond the deal, which is, of course, I think a delusional assumption. But nevertheless, if you assume that, which is what this administration is trying to push, they're not technically nuclear, and they're going to keep Iran from technically being a nuclear power. So that's the world they live in. And then essentially the threat is, well, Israel, look, if you don't want to live with this, you don't have to live with this, but then you just have to live with an overt Iranian nuclear arsenal, as well as the fact that we won't really support you anyway on the Palestinians or other issues. So Israel's really in a lose-lose situation right now, as long as it remains within the structure of how it conceives of this problem. So
before we even go into the structure of how it sees itself, which I think is really key, but I just want to be very clear. The Americans are saying to Israel, essentially, I had Richard Goldberg on the show 2 weeks ago, and we went through, all of the known details of this agreement. So if you guys, by the way, haven't watched that show, you really should, because you get a lot of information there that I think is really important. But essentially, the deal leaves them, as he said, a long weekend away from being a threshold nuclear state, because they just open up the centrifuges and the uranium that they they are stockpiling, that are going to be in storage in Iran through the period that this deal supposedly exists for. But in the meantime, they're going to get off this, right out of the starting block, they're going to have $275 billion, or at least $50 billion from the oil that they're going to be exporting very quickly, that's just been waiting. I think it's been frozen by the sanction, by interdiction, and it'll just be sold to market. So they're going to get an enormous amount of money very, very quickly, and then they'll get up to $1 trillion if if the deal goes through till 2030. And in exchange for that, they're giving away nothing, essentially. I mean, so Israel is being told that if you want to gain some sort of implausible deniability about Iran being a threshold nuclear state, that is, in order to put your head in the sand, you have to allow Iran to receive $275 billion. So I don't actually see what the offer is for Israel to accept here. What am I missing?
Well, there isn't. I mean, at the end, they're basically trying to dictate to Israel just that it's better to be an ostrich and have them not quite over the threshold than actually have them over the threshold and be a nuclear power. So Israel's not buying it, from what I can see. And I think Israel is nervous. And I think what you're beginning to see in Israel is a revision of the way they look at this problem. Some trends are bad and some trends are good. But at the end of the day, it's basically just dictating to Israel, this is the reality. There's nothing, the idea that the Israeli government has any real influence over this administration's Iran policy, I think is, other than on the margins, I just don't see that as realistic. And I was always wondering why they're spending so much time trying to convince this government quietly behind the scenes in the United States, could convince this government, because it's not going to happen. This government's run by progressives. These progressives don't care about Israeli security. They ultimately believe that nuclear weapons in North Korea or in Iran are ultimately a reaction to the nuclear weapons that are in the hands of the United States and France and Britain. That as long as they feel threatened by us and that we have such immense conventional power, they feel the only balancing to it is a nuclear arsenal. So I've heard these people in various conferences and various talks when they're out of government, and this is their mentality. They genuinely believe universal disarmament is the only way forward. By the way, this is, I think, one of the greatest next threats to Israel after Iran goes nuclear, which is the nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, because then the American position will be, despite the fact that it violates several agreements going back to 1968 and 69 with Israel, but that the United States won't support anything that violates or threatens Israel's, quote, strategic programs, which are we all understand what that is. The bottom line is the United States has opposed in every international forum the idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East for that reason. And
but I mean, don't forget that the Obama administration, Obama hosted early on in his presidency, if I recall correctly, he hosted a nuclear free Middle East or world, I can't even remember anymore, conference, and it was a real crisis with Israel. I mean, Israel boycotted the conference. Israel did not send a representative to that conference because it rightly viewed it as an act of aggression against Israel. And I think it was Robert Gates, Obama's first defense secretary, in his confirmation hearings was asked about Iran's nuclear program, and he acted as an apologist for Iran, saying, well, Iran, is worried about Israel, and he may have said that they were worried about Pakistan as well. I can't remember, but it was an extraordinarily hostile statement on his part against Israel that was legitimizing or legitimating, at any rate, and justifying Iran's quest for nuclear weapons as a reasonable response to Israel.
Yeah, and Secretary Gates is not a progressive. So you can only imagine where the progressives are. No, they really believe that at the core of everything is Israeli power. That's the ultimate problem. I mean, remember, there was that statement by Obama during his administration saying the real problem why there's no peace is because the Israelis feel too secure. They want Israel to feel dependent on the United States' nuclear umbrella. In other words, I'm not entirely sure that they're against an Iranian bomb, because at the end of the day, that threatens Israel enough to demand or to necessitate Israel to become even more dependent on the United States. And then that becomes leverage over Israel yet more. But I do believe that after Iran crosses the threshold, you will see the United States shift its position in violation of solemn agreements with Israel. And pick up where Obama left off, President Obama left off, and push for a nuclear weapons-free zone. And we know where that goes, because at the sticking point will be the Iranians will very quickly say, oh, we'll do it. We'll agree. But the Israelis have to go first. And then the Israelis will say, well, we're not going to do that. And then everybody will say, well, just like with the peace process, no matter what happens, it's always Israel's fault. So I think that in this situation, Israel is headed for something very, very dangerous, where both Iran goes nuclear and Israel is the one under siege for its nuclear program as a result, and unless Israel fundamentally changes its path.
Well, there's a question. All right. So if we're already on that fundamentally changing its path, the question really is, what does that even mean? And I think
No.
Nagel's concept, although I didn't have a chance to look deeply into his article, was that, we have to move from preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power to deterring Iran from using their nuclear weapons. And, I don't really see, okay, we can get into an academic argument or discussion about what would mutually assured destruction look like when you're dealing with a regime that that believes that it wants to bring about Armageddon because it believes it's messianic, and its messianism leads it to seek an Armageddon. And its whole concept of power and the purpose of the revolution is to bring about the return of the 12th Imam, the Shiite Messiah, and attacking Israel with nuclear bombs is certainly a way that they think is going to happen. So we can have that kind of a discussion about what deterrence would look like. But, I'm not certain that deterrence or containment could possibly work. And B, I mean, containment is an interesting concept. We can talk about it. But when you say Israel has to fundamentally change its way of looking at things, are you talking about it in sort of a classic Cold War conceptual model of dealing with Iran, or are you looking at something else?
I'm looking at something else. I mean, I don't think this Cold War model works. I think in the Israeli context, deterrence is basically an excuse for strategic passivity to cover failure. I don't see it deterrence working even on the conventional level very well for Israel right now. They keep talking about showing the Palestinians in Gaza, which, in terms of threat to the state of Israel, are minuscule compared to a nuclear Iran. And yet Israel finds itself deterred from actually taking decisive action, and then covers it with this idea, oh, we showed them. And that buys you 2 years, 3 years, maybe 4 years. In the end, what it really only buys you is until there's another American administration that isn't sympathetic to Israel, and then the Palestinians again go to war, which means there's no real deterrence. There's only a strategic decision to go or not go to war. So I don't believe deterrence even works in that circumstance. And I think it's increasingly become an excuse for strategic passivity, not a strategy. The strategy, I would imagine, and by the way, there's so many areas in which this doesn't work. So Iran develops a nuclear weapon. It changes the fundamental concept of the region. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the others will see Israel as weakened. They will, and that can affect the Abraham Accords and peace. It can change the entire climate of the region into a much greater and more radical structure. So even if the deterrence works on the nuclear to nuclear level, underneath there's a massive strategic deterioration that then instantly happens. The second thing is, I'd like to see the day that Iran threatens European cities with nuclear attack if they don't allow them to do certain things to Israel or to respond to Israel. We already see how Europe essentially freaked out over Russian threats in Ukraine. When it became a nuclear threat, that's the one thing the Europeans are freaking out about, and lead them to often talk about immediate ceasefires and so forth. In the Israeli context, all you can imagine the Iranians threatening London or threatening Paris or threatening Berlin or Rome, and basically saying, if you support Israel in any way, in a certain specific circumstance, or even more broadly, then we will put you under threat, or we will do something. And the Europeans will be so nervous about that their policies will shift to becoming even more anti-Israeli. So there are so many implications. Even if deterrence works, it still constitutes a strategic collapse of Israel's position. So so that's not a solution. In my view, Israel has to live up to what it said it was going to do, which is it had a problem. It knew about this problem for 20 years, 25 years at least. It said it will never allow it to happen. So Israel has to now live up to its word, unless it was all one big bluff, in which case one really has to strategically wonder about the Israeli government if it was a strategic bluff. and I'm talking about the Israeli security establishment particularly, which is now, represented and manifest in the person of Gantz. So again, to me, the real action here has to be a determined Israeli signal to the regional allies or regional comrades, so to speak. I wouldn't call them allies, but they're definitely those who are working in coordination with Israel, the UAE and others, and to the United States, that they're done. They're done with the diplomatic route. They're done with strategic patience. There are serious consequences to what are about to happen. And then Israel has to act on those, whether it's a highly escalated and more overt campaign against the Iranian nuclear program. And by the way, I don't believe that there's one big strike that will solve this. It has to be a campaign and an ongoing. Number one, and number two, that Israel will undertake actions that will begin to rattle the very foundations of the Iranian government, and that they will work with regional powers to do so, but that's it. Israel has lost its strategic patience with the West. And that is the fear in Washington, and they've always banked on the fact that at the end of the day, they can dangle in front of Israel goodies, whether it's money and weapons and money to pay for it, and that will compensate for Israeli strategic passivity. And they found in that a perfect partner in the current defense minister, because that is what the defense establishment since 1970 has been anchored to. What you see now is in Israel, the tendency by some to go, whether it's Eisenhower's statement that, well, maybe Israel did a mistake allowing the United States to leave the JCPOA, the Iran deal, or you hear more voices talking about deterrence. What this is that the Israeli security establishment has reached a collapse of its strategic vision. And instead of which, and by the way, that's not its policy on Iran. It's the overall policy of Israel cannot exist but for the grace of America, that Israel cannot act but for the green light from Washington. That is the fundamental strategic concept governing Israeli defense doctrine for already 50 years. And it's deadly. It has led Israel into a lot of bad things, but here it's leading Israel into an existential threat. And that strategic doctrine has now visibly collapsed with the Iran deal that's on the table, or the Iran going nuclear, which are really kind of the same at this point. And instead of reevaluating that and saying, as a Zionist, the fate of the Jews rests on the defense establishment of Israel, which will act whether or not it has the world's approval to defend the Jewish people, which is verbally what they still say, but practically is not what they do. Israel has to return to its roots of the 50s and 60s and do what it needs to do to stop Iran, whether or not it freaks Washington out or not. And by the way, I think in the end, that will actually improve Israel's standing in the West. By the way, that's one last aspect of deterrence that's so deadly. The support for Israel in the United States is based on the imagination it tweaked, it provoked in the American psyche, which is that here's a plucky little nation against the odds who fights for its existence, doesn't ask for help from the United States, and on its own survived against all odds. It's precisely that little image of America itself that they project onto Israel that makes Israel so popular among Americans. And by the way, it's still popular. The idea that Israel would not fight to defend itself against the Iranian nuclear program and instead would prefer to become dependent the way the European countries were during NATO or so forth on the American strategic umbrella and American power devastates the foundations of Israel's support in the United States. At that point, Israel really does become what Israel's enemies always claimed Israel was, which is a strategic albatross weighing the United States down.
It's so, I'm reading Walter Russell Mead's book on Israel, the Ark of the Covenant. I'm about halfway through it. The thing that, he keeps talking about over and over again. I mean, there are two aspects of it that he talks about. One is that the Jewish lobby, such as it has ever been, whether it's related to the Holocaust or it's related to Israel, has always been incredibly weak, that it really hasn't impacted American policy towards Israel one way or another. And another aspect is that the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, particularly, of course, at the time of Israel's founding, the State Department, but also the Defense Department and also the CIA, or they've always been opposed to Israel, first of its establishment and later of its strength. I mean, there was a period during the Cold War in the 1970s that we proved ourselves out during the Six-Day War that we were an effective means to contain Soviet power in the Middle East, and that was really what spurred the alliance that began under Nixon. But that essentially was always about American interests. And he also said the other thing was that foreign policy is very much founded in domestic sentiment and domestic opinion, and that in 1948, the thing that the domestic sentiment that Truman could not ignore was Eleanor Roosevelt and the liberal interventionists that saw Israel, ironically, in retrospect, and the establishment of a Jewish state as proof that the UN system worked, that they wanted more than anything else to have a global government that was going to be capable of preventing future wars. They saw the United States and the Soviet Union both supporting the partition plan in 1947 in UN General Assembly 181, and they would not allow Truman to walk away from the partition plan and from the establishment of a Jewish state following the passage of 181. So it wasn't because of pressure from American Jews, but rather it was the power of the liberal interventionists in the Democratic Party in 1948 that ensured, more than anything else, that Truman was not going to go with the State Department and would support the establishment of Israel. So that was his argument. And I think that what we're seeing on the left is that Israel is no longer supported by public opinion on the American left. And on the right, you're right, that support for Israel is very much a function of the strength that Israel what's the word, that projects outward through the things that we actually do, through actions that we take on our own behalf. And so the more passive that we become to try to placate this very hostile domestic opinion on the left and the establishment, which has always been hostile to us, the less we're supported by the right. And they are the remaining fount of public support for Israel in the United States, as far as I can see.
Well, and I would add to it a certain narrow group of liberals who see their own political fortunes, partly because they're in swing districts or in states that are a bit murky and they could win or lose, and they need crossover votes to survive, or simply because they're threatened so much by progressives that they believe the only way to respond is Israel's become a touchstone issue on the left. You saw it in the last round of primary elections. Israel became a front and center issue in some of these major battles for the Democratic candidacy in the primaries. And fortunately, it sold not badly. Now, I think that it was overplayed in some districts, but the progressives have become obsessed about Israel. They've become obsessed about attacking Israel. And it plays negatively in certain communities on the liberal left in the United States. So there's even some left vote. I wouldn't put it as a very large bankable amount, but maybe 10% of the electorate. But that's what swings votes. That's what swings elections. So for Israel to try to appease this administration and its progressives at the expense of surrendering the support of the right in that liberal sliver, I think it essentially undermines the very foundations of Israel's support in the United States. And again, it's a diplomatic failure to match the strategic failure. But even
and there's another aspect to that. I just want to walk away from America for a little while. We've had there's something interesting that's going on, obviously, in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian army had the two-pronged offensive against the Russians in the north and in the south, in the Kherson area, and in the north in the Kharkiv area. And they've made some pretty significant advances, and they've taken at least two towns where you have railroad lines, railroad heads that are the Russian supply lines, depots for Russian forces. So those are pretty significant achievements on the part of the Ukrainians over the past several days. And we've already seen that Russia took out an S-300 battery from Syria to bring it into the Ukrainian theater. And that enabled Israel to do certain things in Syria that we weren't able to do previously because they were protected by that S-300 battery. So on the other hand, as Russia becomes more needy of hardware, of ammunition, of artillery or whatever, no, not artillery, of drones and other weapon systems, they're strengthening their ties with Iran. And so it's, one of the things that I think it's very important for Israelis to keep in mind, and perhaps also for Americans, and particularly this administration, is that Israel, and again, Mead makes this argument very clearly, that Israel survived through our toughest times without any American support in the 1950s and the 1960s. And there were other powers that worked with Israel, and particularly the French, and to a lesser degree, the Germans. And by the same token, we're not dependent on the United States. We never really were. It was more of an optical illusion than anything else. So that if the United States decides to walk away or start demanding things of Israel that no semi-sentient country could possibly give, like, for instance, taking the blame for Iran's nuclear weapons in exchange for nothing, I think that Israel has other options. But I look at what's happening with Russia, and I wonder if this rules out options or whether it expands options. And I'm looking at other countries, and I'm wondering, when you say that the establishment or Iran's acquisition of weapons is going to destroy Israel's deterrence, or its whole basis of its power in so many profound ways, do you think that we're not going to be able to find people to work with us?
Oh, I think when Israel becomes determined and acts, it will find plenty of people that will work with Israel. If Israel whines and basically says this is terrible, but does nothing and asks the world to save them, they will find nobody to help them. I mean,
Right.
you have to go back to the first 3 days of the war in Ukraine. How many people would have helped Ukraine if Zelensky had fled to Lvov and whined about, oh, the Russians have taken Kiev, oh, the Russians have taken this? Everybody would have said, oh, this is horrible, we love you. And they would have started raising the money for the memorials to Ukraine because they weren't going to lift a finger. It was the fact that he stood up and he did a Henry V. If anybody has not read Shakespeare's Henry V, I commend it to them. But it's that moment where leadership was displayed. And he said, I'm willing to die for this. This is important enough for me that I will go down with my country. And that made him, that made the Ukrainians fight, and that made the world, that tapped the world's imagination to support Ukraine. When you look back in those first week or two of war, nobody was willing to help Ukraine. He forced their hands by appealing directly to the people of Europe and the people of America, and embarrassed the governments of the West into starting to support him. But they weren't going to, but they had to, because there was this mass populist upheaval. So that's a lesson for Israel, that the elites of the West will let Israel twist in the wind, and will let it go down if it had to. This was the lesson of the 50s and 60s too. You just had Channel 12 put on a very interesting little seminar. It's really a campaign ad, where they had 4 or 5 former chiefs of staff of the Israeli military interviewed down in Beersheba on the anniversary of basically to glorify Ben Gurion. And they were all talking about how great Ben Gurion was and how wonderful he was. And they were essentially trying to breathe in, to inhale some of the aura of Ben Gurion to project a stateliness that then they tapped to name their party the Stately Party, I guess is the only way to call it. But anyway,
Stateliness party, yeah.
yeah, the point I'm getting at is, so take a look at Ben Gurion for a second. Do any of those chiefs of staff have anything in common with the most fundamental thing? Right. And here I'm much more sympathetic to the revisionist set of ideas and so forth. And I still think Israel had a misformation in its sort of socialist origins. But that said, one cannot take away from Ben Gurion the fundamental leadership he displayed. And that was, there were 2 or 3 central things. Number one was Western diplomats came to him on the eve of the Declaration of Independence and said, listen, if you wait a couple more weeks, you will get more international support. So wait. It's in your interest to wait. Now, of course, Ben Gurion understood it was now or never. That moment will pass, and there will always be an opportunity for the future that will never be realized. So he understood, seize the moment and act, rather than wait for the wonderful, seductive promises of Western diplomats. The second thing he did is, you have to put yourself back in the position of Israel in 48, which is not altogether dissimilar from the United States in 1776. You were taking on, at that point, Britain wasn't what it seems to be now. Britain was seen to be one of the 2 greatest powers on the face of the earth, an immense superpower in and of itself. And Israel was willing to take them on directly with Glub Pasha and the Arab Legion, who was fighting against Israel to extinguish Israel. This was a British commanded force. Second, the Israelis directly confronted in various circumstances the British. And I'm not just talking about what Menachem Begin did during the revolt and so forth. I'm talking about the fact that Israel sent its just purchased and just created Air Force against the seasoned British Air Force over the Sinai and Negev in 1949 and got into dogfights to directly British-Israeli air battles. This took gumption. This took bravery, but it's what established the foundation of Israel's ethos. It made the point that after the Holocaust,
I think that what Ben Gurion did, if you're going to compare him to anybody, which is why it was ironic that all of these weak-kneed former chiefs of staff who all together, have very little to show for any of their tenures as chief of general staff except failure, that they all tried to ascribe to themselves Ben Gurion's inheritance, that they are the heirs of Ben Gurion, when really ironically, the heir, if you want to talk about it, of Ben Gurion is Netanyahu, because what Ben Gurion did was that he built a doctrine of Israeli strategic independence as a weak state, right, and of pivoting between different countries and of bobbing and weaving as a very weak state to try to get what Israel needed in order to survive. I mean, we did a lot of things with West Germany in terms of turning a blind eye to senior Nazis who were in the German administration because we needed their money, because we were broke, and for other reasons, we needed their weapons because we wanted to develop nuclear weapons and because we needed an arsenal for our army. So there was a lot of things that we were willing to turn a blind eye to because we couldn't do anything about it in order to get the things that we needed and to protect Israel. And so there was this constant back and forth with Ben Gurion that you can look at a lot of the things that were done while he was prime minister and say, how could we ignore the presence of senior Nazis in the German government? And the answer was because we got stuff that we needed from that same Nazi-infused German government in the 1950s. And you can say that on a whole host of issues against a whole group of governments that Ben Gurion had to handle. And Netanyahu came along 50 or 60 years later and he basically had the same concept. It was just that at that point, Israel was powerful. Israel was powerful economically, and Israel was powerful militarily. And then the question became, but we're very weak diplomatically. How do we become stronger diplomatically? Well, we bring our power to bear militarily and economically in order to raise our profile and develop support for ourselves diplomatically. And I think, that they are very similar, just one on a small scale and one on a much larger scale. But the chiefs of staff that gathered around his grave, the exact opposite of both of them.
He's the antithesis of Ben Gurion. And Netanyahu. I think that it's precisely that strength, though, by the way, that the United States feels is the obstacle to peace. I'm not the United States, right. The progressives. I think a lot of Americans see it the other way around. I don't think that this position of the State Department of progressives is the majority American view. In fact, I think it's a fairly limited view in terms of American public opinion. But nevertheless, I think Israel has to be very clear about this. There is, when you look at Rob Malley, when you look at these characters that are in charge of Iran policy, they believe the central problem in the Middle East is Israel. Israel's power, Israel's inability to concede because it feels so strong, and the fact that the region is always in danger of becoming nuclear because Israel's nuclear. So that's the animus that governs these guys, and that's something Israel has to cope with. By the way, the leadership issue was really dual in the 50s, and this is something that really I feel sorry for the previous Prime Minister Netanyahu about, is that in the 50s there were two great leaders governing Israel. One was, of course, the Prime Minister, Ben Gurion, who, again, with many things I disagree with, but in terms of international leadership, he really was very good. But he also had Begin behind him. And what do I mean by that? Every time he wandered into negotiations with the Germans, as you mentioned, and so forth, or the Europeans, he had Begin sitting behind him, basically threatening political attack, to make life miserable politically for Ben Gurion if he conceded to these Europeans. So Ben Gurion could leverage that against the Europeans to drive a tough line. So it's as if you walk into the marketplace, to the shuk and to the marketplace with your friend. If you're sitting there and you're saying, I don't really want that nice piece of furniture, or not furniture, that vase, it's nice, maybe I'll buy it, but I'm not really head set on it. And your friend is saying, just don't buy it, for God's sake, we don't have the money. That strengthens your position negotiating. If your friend is sitting there saying, oh my God, we really need to buy that vase, please give in to him. Well, that weakens your position. Begin played the role of the heavy behind the throne that allowed Ben Gurion a lot of latitude to be tough. Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, always has faced the opposite. He's faced going into the marketplace with a good bit of Israel's elite saying, you got to deal, you got to give him what he wants. And that undercut Prime Minister Netanyahu horribly. So in that sense, it weakened these, but it really was an act of leadership on both Begin to stand on his principles, even on issues like German reparations, and Ben Gurion to navigate the way he did in terms of leadership. So you look at those, they have nothing in common with this current crop of military leaders in Israel. They are the antithesis of that. If they had been around in 48, these chiefs of staff, Israel would not have come into being. It's that simple.
It's speaking of which, let's just make a deal at all costs. We need to make a deal. We're getting that on the northern border, right? With the maritime economic zone talks that Israel is conducting through the Biden administration's mediation with Hezbollah through the Lebanese government. And it was really interesting. I was reading through Maariv the other day, and they were explaining, oh, this is great. We've got Hezbollah where we want him because Nasrallah is stuck. If he opposes this brilliant deal that we're doing with the Lebanese government, of which he's a part, he's going to get in real trouble in Lebanon. And, I mean, you have to deny so many key aspects of reality in order to get to this brilliant analysis of the situation. I mean, the most important one that you have to ignore is the fact that Hezbollah is the government of Lebanon, and it's also the military of Lebanon. And yet you have, this was an article by an Israeli reporter named Ben Caspid, who's basically, got his articles dictated to him by the Gantz crowd. So, this is the line that they're pushing. They're pushing this line that we're brilliant. We're surrendering just an enormous amount of our economic waters to Hezbollah because they're threatening and extorting us, and the Americans are siding with them against us and demanding that we bow to their extortion, right? Including giving up all of our rights basically to the Kana gas field, and even now, the people who are operating Energen, that's operating the Karish gas platform, just announced, look, we can't start at least until the end of October. Why? Because they're under the gun and they don't want to sacrifice their entire program because Hezbollah is threatening to blow the whole thing up. So they're they're bowing to Hezbollah extortion. We're like, oh, this is great. Now we don't really have that big of a deadline. We can go on for a while. We're not concerned about, starting drilling in Karish. And in the meantime, we can give up more of our maritime economic zone to Lebanon because that's really going to weaken Hezbollah when all we're doing is, so, you have this is how they negotiate. They're negotiating with themselves because they're saying we're really close to a deal. But again, no, they're not, because the Lebanese haven't agreed to anything. And just like the Iranians aren't agreeing to a deal, why would Hezbollah agree to a deal if Israel is going to give them everything without a deal in the first place? And look, Israel isn't drilling in Karish because they've threatened us. Then they've already won. And this is how these strategic, geniuses, Gantz and Lapid, are running the show. This is how they conduct negotiations with an enemy state and with a terrorist organization controlled by Iran that has swallowed Lebanon, by ignoring the fact that Hezbollah is Iran and by ignoring the fact that Lebanon is Hezbollah, and then surrendering to Lebanon because they want to be, we want to strengthen Lebanon against Hezbollah. There's so many levels here of self-delusion, and they all lead to one place, which is endangering Israel and pretending that they're strengthening it, pretending that they're building deterrence, pretending that they're developing a partnership with Lebanon.
Again, it exposes the bankruptcy of Israeli military doctrine right now, which is who's being deterred here? What is it basically that the government is saying? That they have to give in to the Lebanese demands or Israel will face a war. So God help us if that happens. So you have to give in. And the Americans demand it, so you have to give in. So who's deterred here? Israel or Hezbollah? I think it's almost a textbook case of deterrence of Hezbollah's against Israel. So that's one thing. The second thing is I don't think they think through the implications at all. First of all, Hezbollah, it isn't about the oil or gas. Hezbollah will be at war with Israel. Lebanon is owned by Hezbollah right now. If Israel wanted to create an independent Lebanon and deal with it as a fiction, then it has to first get rid of Hezbollah. There is no Lebanon as long as Hezbollah is there, that's simply put. And it's really quite stunning, the ability to try to deny that. The second thing too is it betrays the American issue, which is nobody was talking about the borderline until the Americans intervened to try to solve it. And now if it doesn't get solved, there's going to be a war. So it's a perfect example of how American intervention is now leading to war. And you're going to rely then on the United States to be your umbrella and to give you a green light. Again, so many things are exposed by this. Finally, Israel has to think seriously about the gas and every ounce of it, because we see what's happening in Europe. Israel has to have a national export gas strategy to Europe. It's probably one of the most important strategic things Israel can do right now. And it's living in la la land. Up until a year ago, this Israeli government didn't even do anything to encourage the gas. In fact, Karin al-Harar might be very good in some ways, but on the gas issue, she's been a complete disaster. And that's probably, Israel would be a year in advance in its position to get major supplies of gas to Europe, which would strategically shift Israel's position with the Europeans more than any diplomatic settlement of any sort anywhere would do. I mean, let's be realistic. Dealing with the Europeans, I've dealt with them directly as an American official going back 25 years. Carolyn, you've talked with them, you've dealt with them. European officials are mercantile. In the end, the gas from the oil from the Middle East governed their policy for the longest time, and it really made them anti-Israeli. Israel has a chance to break that in coordination, by the way, with 2 or 3 of the Arab states, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. I mean, they have the chance now to break that, and it's dropped completely. So you have to put this deal in that context. It makes everything murky now. It's invited the world to interfere on Israel's gas structure. And how can that be good for Israel? It was under the radar and nobody was interfering. Well, George Soros and the New Israel Fund did to try to stop it. But by and large, it was proceeding ahead without European, American diplomatic interference. So I don't understand why the Israeli government invited this and let this happen. And then I don't understand the concessions, because in the end, it makes one point very clear, which is the point Hezbollah will make and is making. Speaking as a Hezbollahi for a second, we sent drones to threaten Israel's gas structure. They so freaked out that they yielded and conceded to us huge parcels of that gas structure. That's how they will look at it. That is how the Middle East will look at it. That is how the Abraham Accords allies will look at it, which again projects Israeli weakness and despair, which is no foundation for an alliance. So the longer implications of this gas deal are horrific.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. David, I think we'll end our conversation with this. I'll probably have some more. Definitely, I'm going to have some final words to share with the audience. But I think we're going to have to leave the issue of American Jewish involvement or attempt to penetrate Israel's elections. And again, the story that came out this weekend was that you have 8 American Jewish progressive groups that are now putting money into getting the Arab vote out, which is not the first time that this happened. It happened in 2015 as well, but I think we can just leave the whole issue of the collapse of progressive Jewish American support for Israel for another day, and maybe devote an entire conversation to the future or lack thereof of the American Jewish community in absence of a support for Israel. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me today on the program, and let's hope that the Israeli leadership will finally get some sense and realize that a 50-year-old doctrine that has never worked for us has now become an existential danger to the country. So thanks so much, David, for being on the show this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm taping this show on September 11th, 2023. So that would make this the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And it's notable that I recorded the entire show with David just now, and we never mentioned 9/11. And it was only after he left that I realized, 9/11 is today. And the reason why it makes sense is because it's as if, it never happened, right? I mean, even after 9/11, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, George Bush got up and said that the enemy is terrorism, when the enemy was radical Islam. It wasn't one group or another group. It was Islamic terrorists. It was jihadism. It was the Islamic holy war that had come to the United States. And for the past 22 years, the Americans have never acknowledged who the enemy was that day and who the enemy is in the Middle East, because doing so would require them to actually take an action that they didn't want to take, which is wage an ideological war that would be based on something, that would be based on fighting for themselves and fighting against an ideology that
believes that its destiny is to build an Islamic empire worldwide and to subjugate or kill all of the non-Muslims in the world. That is the goal of jihad, and it's written everywhere. It's written in every Islamic source, but the Americans decided that the best way to deal with it was by hiding their head in the sand and not looking at reality in the face. And now they have 2 strategic defeats and trillions of dollars wasted and thousands of US soldiers and officers killed in Iraq and in Afghanistan in pursuit of an agenda that had very little to do with the cause of the war or the identity of the enemy. And when we look at what's happening, and by the way, and not by the way, right, the fact is that the 9/11 attacks were ably assisted, if not designed, by the Islamic Republic of Iran. You had, I don't even remember how many, 11, I think, of the terrorists went through Iran. They traveled on planes with Hezbollah operatives before they came to the United States. After the United States defeated al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the Shura Council of al-Qaeda decamped to Iran, including Saad bin Laden, who was Osama bin Laden's oldest son, who's now supposed to be taking over, according to some reports, after the United States belatedly killed Ayman Zawahiri as the head of al-Qaeda. And he has been living in Iran since the Battle of Tora Bora in 2002. So when we look at the situation, the delusion, the refusal of the United States to see Iran's hand either in 9/11 or later in the wars of Afghanistan and in Iraq, then we understand that for the past 22 years, the United States has been advancing Middle East policies that have been based entirely on ignoring who their enemy is, whether it's Islamic jihadism of the Sunni variety or Islamic jihadism of the Shiite variety. And as a result, we've come to this moment where the United States is essentially enabling Iran to become a nuclear power and going to war against Israel, and to a lesser degree the Sunnis, because they oppose what the Americans are now doing. And David is right. Israel has been saying for over 20 years that we will not allow Iran to become a nuclear power. Well, according to the IAEA, Iran is a threshold nuclear state. So it's time to ante up. Are we going to ante up or not? Benny Gantz has a new campaign slogan. It's Acharai in Hebrew, which means after me. And it's a perfect slogan for somebody who wants to be a military dictator. It's not come with me. It's not, look, I'm going to lead you to a common goal. It's saying, I'm strong. I'm a military commander. I was the commander in chief of the IDF, and I'm surrounding myself with my fellow chiefs of staff of the IDF. And together we're going to lead you to where we think we should go. We're going to conquer this hill. But he doesn't actually have a hill to conquer except the Israeli right. He doesn't actually have a strategic goal in mind aside from pushing Netanyahu out of Israeli politics. And the problem is that the media is pushing the idea that Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, his fellow failed chief of general staff of the IDF, who's now number 3 in his party, that they know what they're doing because of their medals and because of their ranks, but they don't. The concept that they're pushing and the concept that Yair Lapid is pushing is that we have somebody that we can trust in Washington. And every single day, it becomes more and more clear that the opposite is the case. The United States, the same United States who was led by George W. Bush, who told the American people after 9/11 that the way that they should respond to the al-Qaeda attacks on Washington and New York was by going shopping, is the same in the United States that elected Joe Biden in 2020 when he promised that he was going to go back to the Iran nuclear deal that gives Iran a nuclear bomb. And that is a sad truth. Obviously, there's great reason to love the American people, but the tens of millions of Americans who voted for Joe Biden either share an ideology that doesn't make sense or is not part of the American tradition, or they simply don't know what's happening. And I think the same thing can be said of the Israelis who are voting for left-wing parties. We have come to that crunch moment in Israeli history where it's a do or die moment. We actually have to take concerted action to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear armed state. We can't rely on the United States to help us. The United States will absolutely not help us. In fact, they're going to try to hinder our operation. They've made that very, very clear. We have to act right now. If not right now, then we have to act this year, because by 2023, it'll be too late. And, arguably, it's already rather late. But I also think that it's true, and I think that what Walter Russell Mead wrote in his book, The Ark of the Covenant, that Israel is not alone, that Israel is not dependent on the United States, that there is a limit to the pressure that the United States can exert on Israel, because Israel has its own powers and its own ability to develop partnerships with other countries, and we're not dependent on the United States. I think it's time that Israel take the training wheels off and decide that we're going to act on our own, because we've come to that moment. Everybody's telling us that we've come to that moment. Wendy Sherman is saying it, Tony Blinken is saying it, and the IAEA is saying it, the head of the Mossad is saying it, our own intelligence is saying it. So our leaders have to listen, and the Israeli people have to listen. On November 1st, we have to vote as people who listen and who see and who recognize that crunch time has come. And I do hope that the message will go out and people will vote as we need in order to survive as a country. Because it's true that if we say, okay, we're going to move to a mutually assured destruction model now with Iran having not fulfilled our word, having not taken action to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear armed state, nobody's going to take us seriously. Nobody's going to take us seriously. Nobody's going to take us seriously, unless we take ourselves seriously. And so it's really time for us to take ourselves seriously. So I thank you very much. Those are my parting thoughts. And, I hope that this program and our growing audience on JNS and on the Carolyn Glick Mideast News Hour channel, that all of these together and our website and our podcast and our Rumble channel that you can also watch the show on, all of these things are going to add up, and people are going to start listening, and we all just have to start talking, and we have to make clear that we understand that this is the time that Israel has to act. This is the time that Israel has to recognize that after 74 years, we're on our own, and that's okay. We can stand on our own, because if we don't stand on our own, we're going to fall on our own. So thanks very much for watching. Remember to subscribe to JNS YouTube channel or to the Carolyn Glick Mideast News Hour channel on YouTube and on Rumble and on Spreaker. But make sure you subscribe, and make sure that you subscribe your friends and nodding acquaintances. We passed the 7,000 subscription on Carolyn Glick Mideast News Hour. We passed, I think, 1,000 or 2,000 on JNS. So we just have to keep building up that audience. Let's keep building it up, because the more people know about this stuff, the more likely we're going to see a change in Israeli behavior that's going to accord with the very difficult reality that we find ourselves in. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week.